He heard the city disappear, not gradually. One moment there was the ordinary noise of Mayfair at dusk, the clatter of wheels on wet stone, the call of a vendor, the footfall of 100 strangers going in 100 directions, and the next moment the fog came down and swallowed all of it, and the Duke of Stirling sat alone in his stopped carriage, listening to the sound of nothing, which was the sound he feared most in the world. "Hobbs," he said. No answer. Hobbs. Louder. And he hated himself for the loudness, for the way his voice had gone up at the end, in the manner of a man who is not certain his words are reaching anyone. Through the carriage window, and he had stopped reaching for windows months ago, had stopped the reflex of looking, because looking produced nothing, had trained himself out of it the way you trained yourself out of touching a burn. He could hear the fog itself. That was the particular horror of a London pea souper. It was not silent. It made noise. The yellow vapour absorbed and distorted the city's sounds until they came from the wrong directions, until a horse was suddenly close when it had been distant, until footsteps appeared and then vanished, until the entire geography of the familiar city became unreliable and strange. He had been blind for 22 months. He had learned, in those 22 months, to construct the world from sound and texture, and the precise internal map of every space he regularly occupied. His study, his bedroom, the path from his front door to the carriage step, which he had walked so many times with his hand on Thomas's elbow that he could have walked it in his sleep, which was, he sometimes thought in the particular dark of 3 o'clock in the morning, all that his life had become, a walk in his sleep, a movement through a world he could no longer see and had largely stopped wishing to. But this was not his study. This was not the path from his front door. This was somewhere on the south side of Grosvenor Street, he thought, in a carriage that had stopped, in a fog that had made the city strange, and his coachman had gone. Had climbed down to check the horses, perhaps, had gone to find a landmark, had been swallowed by the vapour like everything else. The Duke of Stirling sat in the stopped carriage and listened to London become unreliable and thought, with the specific and exhausting clarity of a man who had been thinking the same thought for 22 months. I cannot do this. He had been saying, I cannot do this, since the morning he woke in the physician's house and understood, from the quality of the darkness, that it was permanent. He had said it, about breakfasting alone, and about parliamentary correspondence, and about the expressions on his staff's faces that he could no longer read, and about the particular daily humiliation of requiring assistance for things that had been had effortless. He had said it, and meant it, and continued. Because the alternative to continuing was not available, or he had not been brave enough to take it, and he was no longer certain which of those things was true. Hobbs, he said, for the third time, and this time he did not try to conceal what was in his voice. Nothing answered. He reached for the door handle. He found it. His hands were very good now at finding things, at moving through space with the careful precision of someone who could not afford errors. And he opened the carriage door and put one foot onto the step, and then the other, and stood on this London street in the yellow fog and listened. The sounds came from everywhere and nowhere. Hooves, somewhere to the left. But the fog made distance impossible. The horse could be 20 feet away or 200. A voice calling something, absorbed by the vapour before it resolved into words. Somewhere, a church bell, and he counted. 6 o'clock. It was 6 o'clock, which meant the fog had come early, and would be with them until morning, which was the kind of calculation that had replaced a different kind of calculation in his life, the kind that involved reading a room, and assessing a political situation and understanding from a man's face what he was actually saying. He stood on the street and did not know which direction was home. He who had known this city since he was a boy. He who had walked every street in Mayfair in the daylight of a life he had not thought to be grateful for, because gratitude had not seemed necessary. The city was still there. He could hear it, distorted and unreliable in the fog, and he could not reach it, and it could not reach him. And he was alone in the middle of it in the way that he had been alone in the middle of everything for 22 months. Surrounded by a world he could no longer read. He took one step. He put his foot down carefully on the wet stone, found it level, transferred his weight. He took another. The cane was in the carriage. He had left it because he had expected Hobbs, because he had not anticipated the fog, because he was a man who made plans, and the plans had failed, and he was standing in the middle of Grosvenor Street, or somewhere near it, with no cane and no coachman and no direction. He stopped. He stood very still, and he thought, "This is the thing itself. This is the thing I have been pretending to manage for 22 months. Not the blindness. The moment when the blindness becomes the full and final fact of the matter, and there is nothing left to pretend, the fog moved around him. London made its distorted noises, and then a hand took his. Before we go any further into this story, if you are new to Moonlight at Mayfair, this is the place for stories that stay with you. Stories about courage and dignity, and the unexpected people who find us when we are most lost. Subscribe, so you never miss what comes next. And if you have been here before, thank you for coming back. Now, back to him, standing in the fog, and the small hand that just changed everything. It was small, that was the first thing. The absolute smallness of it. 4 fingers and a thumb, the hand of a child of perhaps 7 or 8 years, fitting entirely within his palm without filling it. The grip was not tentative, it was not performing comfort. It was simply present. A hand that had arrived and taken his as a practical matter, with the calm of someone for whom this was an ordinary action in an ordinary world. He did not speak for a moment. He was managing something. The shock of being touched when he had not anticipated it. And beneath the shock, something older and more complicated. The shock of being found. "Who is there?" he said. A voice small and direct and carrying the flat vowels of the East End. "Nell, sir. I seen you standing." A pause. "You shouldn't stand in the middle. The carts can't see in the fog, and they don't stop," he said. "No, I expect they don't." "Are you lost?" she said. Not with pity. With the practical curiosity of a child assessing a situation that requires practical management. He said, "Yes. Where do you live?" he told her. "Sterling House, Grosvenor Square," which, in the particular grammar of London addresses, communicated a great deal about who he was, though the child either did not know or did not find it relevant, because her response was immediate and businesslike. "That's not far," she said. "I know the way. Come on then." She did not wait for agreement. She simply began walking, and his hand went with her, because the alternative was standing in the fog alone, and some instinct, older and more honest than his pride, had already made the decision. He followed. Her footsteps were remarkable. Add to basket. He had been attending to footsteps for 22 months. It was one of the first skills you acquired, the reading of movement, the construction of a person from the sound of how they moved through a space. And this child moved through the fog with a confidence he had not heard in many adults. Not fast, not careless, but completely certain, the footsteps of someone who had learned the city from a different angle than he had, from below rather than above, and who knew its surfaces and obstacles and rhythms in the specific granular way of someone for whom the city was a daily survival rather than a comfortable background. "Step up here," she said, and he stepped up, and his foot found a curb. "And down," she said, and he came down. She did not tell him why. She did not explain the city to him as a geography. She simply said the words that corresponded to the immediate action required. And he performed the action, and they moved. His boots were loud on the wet stone. He could hear the difference between their footfalls and found it absurd briefly. The polished heaviness of a duke's boots and the light. Quick sound of a child's worn shoes moving together through the fog. The child was in front of him and slightly to his left, her arm extended back to hold his hand, her body a small anchor in the yellow dark. He thought about how he must look. The thought arrived, and he dismissed it, because thinking about how he looked was a vanity he had spent 22 months dismantling, and because the fog had removed the audience in any case. There was no one to see the Duke of Stirling being led through Mayfair by a child's hand. There was only the child and the fog and the wet stone under his feet and the movement that was taking him somewhere. "What's wrong with your eyes?" she said. He said, "I was in an accident, a carriage." He paused. 2 years ago. Does it hurt?" "No," he said. "Not anymore." She considered this. He could hear her, considering it in the brief quality of her silence before she spoke again. "My mum says some things stop hurting, but you still remember they did," she said. "Is it like that?" He walked for several steps before he answered. "Yes," he said. "It is very much like that." She seemed satisfied by this. She turned them slightly. He felt the adjustment in the angle of her arm and leaned into the guidance without thinking. And the sounds around him shifted, which meant they had turned onto a different street. "There's a crossing here," she said. "I go first, then pull you. Don't let go." "I won't," he said. She went, pulling him quickly across the space between two curbs. And he heard the sound of horses to his left, too close, and felt the displacement of air as something large passed behind them. "All right," she said, on the other side, checking back without breaking pace. "It's all right." He had not said anything. He did not think his grip had changed. She had simply known to check. He said, "How old are you?" "8," she said. "Nearly 9. A pause. "How old are you?" he said. 34. "That's old," she said, without particular judgment. "Yes," he said. "It is beginning to feel that way." They walked in the particular silence of two people who are doing something together that does not require conversation, and found that the silence made conversation easier rather than harder. He had forgotten this. He had been so long in silence that was empty. The silence of his study in the evenings. The silence of the dinner table, where once there had been guests. The silence of rooms that had been arranged around a man who used to move through them differently. That he had forgotten that silence could be a space rather than an absence. "Is this your area?" he said. "This part of the city?" "Sometimes," she said. "I sell flowers near the square when the weather's good. It's not good often." She turned them again. He was beginning to lose his internal geography. He had turned too many times, and the fog had removed the remaining landmarks. And the child's hand was the only reliable thing. "In the bad weather, I sweep crossings, where people don't want to get their shoes muddy." He thought about her shoes. He thought about the worn quality of the sound they made, not the deteriorated shuffle of truly destitute shoes, but the sound of shoes that had been worn until they were the shape of someone's feet and no more. He said, "Do you live nearby?" "Down the other side," she said, with a vagueness that communicated both direction and the specific diplomacy of a child who does not describe where she lives to people she has just met. He said, With your family. My mum, she said. My brothers. Dad's not. He went away. He said nothing. The simple construction of that sentence, he went away, the child's language for a thing that had no good language, sat in the fog between them and he let it be there. What was the accident like? She said. He was quiet for a moment. People did not ask him about the accident. Not because they did not want to know. He had always understood they wanted to know, but because asking would require acknowledging it directly, and his social world had become very skilled at not acknowledging things directly. It was, he had decided, one of the costs of rank, that people managed their conversations with you according to what they thought you could bear, which was rarely the same thing as what you actually could. Very fast, he said. I don't remember most of it. I remember the sound. The horses. He paused. And then I remember waking in someone's house and it being dark and thinking it was night, and then understanding that it was morning. That must have been frightening, she said. He said, yes. Were you frightened now? She said. Before I found you. He considered whether to give the polished answer. He decided in the fog, with his hand in hers, that the polished answer was a waste of both their time. Very, he said. She received this matter-of-factly, as she seemed to receive everything. I thought so, she said. You were very still. When people are lost, they usually walk in circles. You were standing still. Mum says that's what you do when you're really frightened. You go still, he said. Your mother sounds wise. She is, the child said, with the absolute conviction of someone who has not yet arrived at the age of qualifying the things she knows to be true. She knows a lot of things. She just doesn't have money for them. He walked with that sentence for a while. She made one mistake. She brought them around a corner, and he heard the sound of the ground change, the hollow resonance of a surface that was not solid stone, the particular quality of wooden boards over something, and he put his foot down on the first board and felt it shift. Wait, she said. But he had already put his weight forward, and the board gave, and he was suddenly off balance, his free hand grasping at air, the fog providing no reference, no horizon, nothing. Her grip tightened to a degree he had not anticipated from a hand that small. She pulled back and sideways in one motion, quick and certain, not panicked. And he found the curb behind him and stabilized, both feet back on stone. He stood breathing for a moment. She said, Sorry, I forgot about that one. It's a cellar cover. Someone's broken it. She did not perform the apology. She stated it, noted the cause, moved on. Are you all right? He said. Yes, she said. Your hands are shaking. He said, I know. She said nothing for a moment. He felt her standing beside him rather than in front. She had positioned herself at his side, the arm she was using to hold his hand pressed closer to him than before, so that he could feel the warmth of her through his coat. She said, I've got you. 4 words. From a child of 8 years who weighed nothing, who owned nothing, who was standing in a London fog at 6 o'clock at night, holding the hand of a man 4 times her size and 400 times her rank, and who said it with the specific, unqualified certainty of someone for whom having someone was a matter of practice rather than sentiment, he thought. I have been had by a great many people over the course of my life, attended, assisted, managed, organised, consoled. I have had servants and solicitors and physicians and friends who meant well, and members of Parliament who did not mean well, and a social world that had, since the accident, thinned to almost nothing. As people understood that he would not recover, that the Duke of Stirling in the darkness was a different and less useful Duke of Stirling than the one they had known. He had not been had in this sense. The sense that meant, I am here and you will not fall. And that is all that is required of this moment. He said, "Thank you, Nell," she said. "Come on then. We're nearly there." The last quarter of the walk was quieter. The fog was still thick. He could hear it in the way the sounds remained distorted, in the particular hush of a city operating at reduced capacity. But something had shifted in the quality of their movement. They had found a rhythm. His heavy boots and her worn shoes had settled into a pace that was theirs together, rather than his following hers, and the pulling had eased because he was reading her arm rather than waiting for her words. She said, "What's it like?" he said. "What is what like?" "Your house," she said. "The big one. I've seen it from the square. It's very big." He considered the house. He had lived in it for 34 years and had not, in the last 22 months, thought about it as anything other than a collection of paths he had memorized, and rooms where the furniture had been moved by his staff to remove obstacles and then moved again, slightly, which meant he was always finding the edge of a table where he had not expected an edge, and which produced in him a specific fury he was not proud of. "It is very large," he said. "Larger than it needs to be. Are there a lot of people in it?" "A staff," he said. "Servants, but," he paused, finding the honest form, "not many people, not the way you mean." She was quiet, digesting this. "That seems lonely," she said. He said, "Yes, lonelier than our rooms," she said. "We've got 4 of us in 2 rooms and it's very loud. But I think I'd be frightened alone in a big house." He thought about the silence of Stirling House in the evenings. The silence of a house that had been built for a family, and currently contained one man who moved through it carefully, and a staff that moved through it quietly, and the accumulated furniture of several generations of Stirlings who had filled these rooms with their lives and left the rooms behind. He said, "I think you are right that it is lonelier than your rooms," she said. "That doesn't seem fair." He said, "No, it doesn't. You should have more people in it," she said. With the simple practicality of someone who has just solved a problem, he said, "That is not an uncomplicated thing to arrange." Why? He thought about how to answer this. He thought about the particular complications of being the Duke of Stirling since the accident. The invitations that had stopped because it was difficult to include a blind man in the usual social occasions, or because people did not know how to be with him now, or because he had refused the early invitations until they stopped coming, which had seemed at the time like the exercise of appropriate restraint and had turned out in practice to be the voluntary construction of the very prison he complained of inhabiting. He thought about how to explain the architecture of his isolation to a child of 8 who had 4 people in 2 rooms and thought this a reasonable arrangement. He said, "I made some choices after the accident that were perhaps not wise," she said. "What choices?" he said. "I decided that it was better not to be seen, in the state I was in." He paused. "I thought that a man who could not see could not be what was required, could not be useful, could not be present in the way that a man of my position is supposed to be present." She was quiet for several steps. Then, "Can you still think?" "Yes," he said, slightly startled. "Can you still talk?" "Yes." "Can you still know things and decide things?" "Yes," he said. "Then what did you need your eyes for that you can't do without them?" He walked with the weight of that question, which a child of 8 had produced with no particular philosophy in mind, but simply with the direct logic of someone who assessed situations by what was present rather than by what was absent, and which was, he found, the most useful question anyone had asked him in 22 months. He said, "That is a very good question," she said. "Mum says people use their eyes too much. She says you learn more from listening," he said. She has been proven right in my experience. What have you learned? She said. Not testing him, genuinely asking. He said that the city sounds different at different hours. That people in a hurry walk differently than people who are frightened. That rain is coming before it arrives if you pay attention to the air. He paused. That some people's voices contain everything they are trying not to say, if you listen below the words. She considered this. Can you hear that in mine? She said. He said, you are not trying not to say anything. She seemed to take this as a compliment. I don't see the point, she said, of not saying things. It just means they don't get sorted, he said. It does, she said. Is that what happened to you? Things didn't get sorted, he said. With the honesty the fog permitted. Many things did not get sorted. Yes, I was. Not particularly in the habit of allowing them to be, she said. You should sort them, he said. I am beginning to think so. We're here, she said. He heard it before she said it. The change in the acoustic, the particular resonance of a larger open space after the enclosed street. And then the sound he had been hearing for 34 years without knowing he was listening. The sound of the iron gates of Stirling House, which had a specific quality in the wind. A low, faint tone, almost a note, that he had never once registered with his eyes, and now recognised with absolute certainty. He stopped. He stood at the edge of Grosvenor Square, in the fog, outside his own gates. And he felt something he had not felt in 22 months. The specific, precise sensation of home that is not about walls or furniture or the memory of a floor plan, but about the sound of a gate you have known all your life and the particular quality of the air in a place you belong to. He had not felt he belonged to it for 22 months. He had occupied it. He had survived in it. It had not occurred to him, in the careful, managed, impoverished daily life of the blind Duke of Stirling, that belonging was something you felt rather than something you possessed. It occurred to him now. The child's hand was still in his. He said, Nell. Yes, she said. He said, you live on the other side, the east side. Yes, she said. He said, it is not safe for you to go back through the fog alone. He paused. It is not safe for you to go back through it at all. Not tonight, she said. I do it all the time, he said. I know. And I would like. He stopped. He was finding the words for something he had not expected to find words for tonight. I would like you to come inside. Until the fog lifts. I will send word to your mother so she does not worry. A pause. He could feel her assessment of this proposal. The specific quality of a child who has been taught rightly to be careful about strangers and who is weighing this stranger against the evidence of the past hour. She said, your house is very big and there are not many people in it. No, he said. You'd have to tell them to be nice, she said. Your servants, they might not know what to do with me, he said. I will tell them, she said. And you'll send to my mum, he said, immediately. One of the footmen will go tonight, fog or no. Another pause. Then her hand tightened slightly in his, which was not agreement exactly, but was its body language. She said, your gates are very loud, he said. I know. I have only just noticed. He felt her look up at him, felt it in the change of her posture, the slight shift of her arm's angle. She said, you can hear a lot, can't you? When you pay attention. He said, I am learning to. She said, good. And then, come on then. It's cold. She turned them toward the gate. He found the latch. His hands knew it perfectly. 22 months of navigating this entrance every day. And it opened. And they went through, and the gate closed behind them with its particular low tone. Like a note on an instrument he had never learned the name of. The gravel of the drive was under his feet. He knew every foot of it. He walked it without hesitation. and the child walked beside him rather than in front, their pace the same now, her hand still in his. From somewhere above the fog, a thin thread of lamplight fell through the yellow vapour and lay across the gravel. The fog was not lifting, it would not lift for hours, but the lamplight was there, and she walked into it, and he could not see it, but he felt the warmth of it on his face. He stopped for a moment, just for a moment. He turned his face toward it. "What is it?" she said. He said, "There is a light." "Yes," she said. "From the house. It's yellow in the fog," he said. "Tell me what it looks like." She was quiet. And he thought she might not know what to do with the question, might answer with yellow or bright, and that would be sufficient. But she looked at it with the specific attention she had been paying to everything all evening, the child's unhurried attention that received the world as it was, rather than as it was supposed to be, and she said, "It looks like. The fog is trying to swallow it, but it can't quite. The light keeps going. It gets blurry at the edges, but the middle stays clear. Like it's deciding to be there." He stood with that. "Yes," he said quietly, "yes. Like it is deciding to be there." She looked up at him again. He felt it. "Do you like that?" she said. He said, "Very much." He took them up the remaining steps to the front door. Thomas, who had apparently made it back and had clearly been in a state about the fog and the carriage and the missing Duke, opened the door before he could reach it, with the specific guilt of a man who has failed an employer and knows it and has been standing at the door for 20 minutes hoping to correct it. "Your Grace." "It is all right, Thomas," the Duke said. "This is Nell. She guided me home." He paused. "She will be staying until the fog lifts, and her mother has been sent word. Will you see to both?" There was a brief, charged silence, the particular silence of a household member encountering a situation outside the ordinary parameters, and then Thomas said, "Of course, Your Grace." He said to Nell, "Go with Thomas. He will find you something warm and something to eat, and he will send to your mother." "I promise," she said. "All right. And then?" "Your house sounds very big from the inside too," he said. "It is," she said. "You should fill it up." He stood in the doorway of Stirling House. He felt the warmth of the house behind him, and the fog before him, and the specific, almost physical sensation of 22 months of interior imprisonment standing at this threshold alongside him. Waiting to see what he would decide, he said, "I intend to." She went with Thomas, her small shoes making their worn sound on the marble of the entrance hall, echoing in a way they would not echo in 2 rooms shared by 4 people. He stood for a moment longer at the door, not going in and not going out. He had not stood in a doorway in 22 months. He had moved through doorways, quickly, with the specific anxiety of a man who knows the width of his own doors and walks them with the care of someone for whom a doorframe is a hazard. He had not stood in one. He had not occupied the threshold of his own house as a place to be rather than a thing to navigate. He stood in it now. He let the fog be there and the lamplight be there and the sound of his house, its warm, specific, complicated, too large, presently too empty sound, surround him. He thought about a child who walked a broken city in worn shoes and found a lost man and brought him home without asking why or requiring thanks or performing the charity of it. He thought about, "I've got you," said with the certainty of someone who has very little and gives it entirely. He thought about the question she had asked. Can you still think? Can you still talk? Can you still know things? And the 3-part answer, which had required very little thought, and had, in the requiring of very little thought, been the most clarifying thing said to him in the long months of his diminishment. He thought, the fog is still there. He could not see the city. He could not see the square or the lamplight or the fog itself. He could hear all of it. He could feel the cold of it and the warmth behind him and the specific, living reality of a house that was his and had his gates sound and held currently a child of 8 years who thought the house should be filled up. He thought, "She is right." He went inside. He closed the door. The gate's low tone sounded once, faintly, through the fog and the door and the 22 months. And he heard it. He did not let her go back into the fog alone. This was both the practical decision it appeared to be and the beginning of a different kind of decision. The kind that, in the weeks following, extended itself with the slow but deliberate motion of a man who has been still for too long and has decided to begin moving. He sent for Nell's mother that same night. Mrs. Mary Britton came to Stirling House at 8:30, with the specific wariness of a woman who has been summoned to the house of a duke and does not know what that means for her daughter, and left an hour later, with arrangements that she had been permitted to examine fully and negotiate honestly, because the Duke of Stirling had spent a long time in a chair in his study that evening, thinking about what a woman of intelligence and very little money would actually need to hear in order to trust the word of a man who had everything she lacked. The arrangements were these. Nell would come to Stirling House 3 mornings a week. There were books in the library that the Duke could not read himself, and that he found he needed read to him by someone who read them the way she saw a lamplight in fog, for what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be. There were people in the house who needed the particular quality of attention she apparently provided at no effort to herself. There was a room that could be used, and food that would not go unmade, and wages that were honest. Mrs. Britton said, "And what does she give you in return?" The Duke said, "Company, and correction when I am wrong, which she provides without apparent concern for my feelings, which I have found is what I require." Mrs. Britton said, "She does do that," he said. "I know." He stood up from his chair when she left. He did not need to stand. He could conduct conversations sitting, and standing required locating himself in the room and moving toward the door, both of which required more navigation than sitting and waiting for Thomas to show her out. He stood because it was the correct form, because she was a woman deserving of the correct form, because he was the Duke of Stirling, and the correct form was one of the things that had survived the fog and the dark and the 22 months of attrition. And he was, he decided, going to recommit to the things that survived. He stood and extended his hand, and she shook it. The hand of a duke, the hand of a woman who swept floors and sold flowers, and had done what was required of her in a difficult world, and had raised a daughter who walked with certainty in the fog. He said, "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for sending for me." She went. The house was quiet again, but differently quiet. The quiet of a house that has had people in it recently, and still holds the shape of them in the air. Nell had fallen asleep in a chair in the servants' hall. He was told this by Thomas, who seemed, in the telling, to be managing some living about the whole evening that was more considerable than Thomas usually permitted himself. She had eaten considerably, Thomas reported, which the Duke found he was glad to hear, and she had looked at the library and said it was very full of books, and did anyone read them? And Thomas had said not recently, and she had said that seemed a waste. Thomas had apparently agreed. The Duke sat in the library that evening, in the quiet of Stirling House, and listened to the fog pressing against the windows and to the gate's faint sound when the night wind moved, and thought about a day that had begun as a managed, Predictable movement through the world he had constructed for himself and had become something else entirely, he thought. She asked me what I had learned. And I told her about rain and footsteps and the voices below the words. I did not tell her what I learned tonight, which is that the world will produce people who take your hand in the dark if you are still enough to let it happen. That the city will not abandon you in the fog. That someone you have never met will find you and say, "I've got you," and mean it with the whole uncomplicated certainty of someone who has not yet learned the limits of themselves, he thought. I have been learning the limits of myself for 22 months. I have been building a life within them, which is not the same as living, he thought. She is 8 years old, nearly 9. She knows the way from Grosvenor Street to Grosvenor Square in a fog that made the city unreadable. She knows how to pull a man back from a broken cellar cover and how to say "I've got you" and how to look at a light in the fog and describe it as something that is deciding to be there, he thought. That is, perhaps, what he needs to be, a light that is deciding he was not there yet. He would not claim to be there yet because she had also taught him. In 60 minutes of fog and wet stone and the sound of worn shoes, that the honest answer to a question is almost always more useful than the managed one. And the honest answer was, he was at the threshold. He was in the doorway. He had not yet walked through, but he was standing in it. He was facing the right direction. He could feel the warmth behind him. That was, he decided, enough for tonight. Tomorrow he would begin, and perhaps that is why this story stays with us. Not because a duke was rescued or a child was rewarded, or the fog lifted to reveal a city unchanged and beautiful, but because a man who had decided that his darkness was permanent encountered a child for whom darkness was simply a condition requiring navigation, and discovered that the difference between those two things was not courage or wealth or sight, but the willingness to take the hand that is offered. She gave him nothing he could not have found himself if he had been moving. The city was there. The gate was there. The warmth of the house was there. She gave him the thing that made those things possible. The hand and the voice that said, "I've got you," and the footsteps that did not waver. Sometimes that is all we need from another person. Not rescue, not repair, just the warm, steady, entirely sincere presence of someone who knows the way and who has decided, without making anything of the decision, to take us with them. That is perhaps the most honest definition of grace. The small hand in the dark, the certain step, the voice that says, without performance or sentiment, simply and completely, "Come on then, we're nearly there. They always are." Subscribe to Moonlight at Mayfair and come back for the next story, Beneath the Soft Light of the Evening Star. Moonlight at Mayfair, where every love is hard won and every ending is deserved.